3 women vanished without a trace in the middle of the night, inside a quiet suburban home in Missouri. Their cars were still parked neatly in the driveway, their purses and keys left behind, the porch light burning as if nothing had changed. But by dawn, the house was empty, and it would remain that way forever. It was the summer of 1992 in Springfield, Missouri, a time when neighborhoods felt safe, when teenagers celebrated their high school graduations without fear. On the evening of June 6th, 2 best friends, Stacy McCall, just 18, and her slightly older friend, Suzie Streeter, 19, were out with classmates. Hopping from one graduation party to another, they laughed, took photos, made plans for a carefree summer before college. Nothing about the night suggested it would be their last. By the early hours of June 7th, they were tired. Instead of crashing at a friend's house crowded with partygoers, the girls decided to head back to Suzie's home. Waiting there was Suzie's mother, Cheryl Levitt, a 47-year-old hairdresser who had raised her daughter with quiet devotion. Cheryl had spent the evening at home, watching TV, waiting for her daughter's return. From the outside, the small house on East Delmar Street looked untouched the next morning. Inside, it told a stranger story. The women's purses were neatly lined up in the living room. The beds looked slept in, but not disturbed. Cheryl's beloved Yorkshire Terrier was pacing nervously, locked in the bathroom. The front porch light bulb had been shattered and the glass carefully swept away, as if someone wanted darkness without leaving a mess. Even the television hummed with static, stuck on a broken channel. But of Cheryl, Suzie, and Stacy, there was nothing. No signs of a struggle, no broken windows, no forced entry. They had simply evaporated into the night. At first, no one wanted to believe it. Friends thought maybe the women had stepped out for breakfast. Family assumed they were running late. But by the end of that Sunday, when calls went unanswered and the house remained eerily silent, panic spread. Springfield police would launch one of the largest investigations in the city's history, but the mystery only deepened with every lead. 3 women, 3 lives, one house full of unanswered questions, and a case that, decades later, continues to haunt both investigators and an entire community. The night of June 6, 1992, was supposed to be nothing more than a celebration, a rite of passage for dozens of Springfield's high school seniors. Graduation meant freedom, and for many, it was the last night together before college, jobs, and adulthood scattered them in different directions. Music drifted from backyard speakers, soda cans clattered on porches, and clusters of teens laughed as they moved from one party to the next. Among them were Stacy McCall, 18, and Suzie Streeter, 19. Stacy had just walked across the stage that afternoon, diploma in hand, smiling in her graduation gown while her family cheered from the bleachers. Suzie, though already out of high school, was close friends with Stacy, sharing the kind of easy bond that made them nearly inseparable. Both were blonde, bright, and full of plans for the summer. Their evening began with excitement, bouncing between gatherings, their arms linked as they posed for snapshots that would later become haunting reminders of their final hours. At one party, they talked about staying overnight, but the house was packed wall to wall with teenagers, and the thought of sleeping on a crowded floor didn't sound appealing. "Let's just go back to my place," Suzie suggested, meaning her small home on East Delmar Street. It would be quieter, more comfortable, and besides, Cheryl, her mother, was waiting there. The decision seemed casual, unimportant at the time, but it would place them at the center of a mystery that has endured for decades. Friends remembered their moods that night, light-hearted, a little tired, ready to wind down after hours of dancing and laughter. There was no sign of fear or hesitation. They weren't being followed. They weren't looking over their shoulders. They were just 2 young women closing out the happiest night of their lives. Around 2 a.m., they left the last party and slipped into Stacy's car. The drive across town to Suzie's home was short, a familiar route on streets they had traveled countless times. No one who saw them that night noticed anything unusual. No one realized they were watching the final moments before the women disappeared. Inside the Delmar Street house, Cheryl had been preparing for bed. The 47-year-old hairdresser had recently divorced and was looking forward to a new chapter in her life. She was proud of her daughter, close to her, and welcomed Stacy as though she were family. To Cheryl, it was just another summer night, waiting up for the sound of her daughter's footsteps on the porch. By sunrise, neighbors would be walking their dogs, sprinklers would hum across suburban lawns, and graduation balloons would still be tied to fences. But inside that small house, a silence would settle that no one could explain. While Stacy and Suzie moved through the night's celebrations, another figure waited quietly at home. Cheryl Levitt, 47 years old, was Suzie's mother. Recently divorced, she had built a modest life for herself and her daughter inside a small, single-story house on East Delmar Street. Friends described Cheryl as warm, grounded, the type of woman who could make anyone feel welcome. She was petite, soft-spoken, with a strength that came from raising a daughter largely on her own. That evening, Cheryl had no grand plans. She spent the night in her living room, tending to household chores and watching television. For her, weekends often meant a chance to unwind after long days at the salon, where she styled hair for loyal clients who trusted her, not just with their looks, but with their secrets. She was known for listening, for giving advice, for being steady in a world that wasn't always kind. Suzie was the center of Cheryl's world. Mother and daughter shared a bond that went beyond the usual boundaries, strengthened by years of leaning on each other after the divorce. They ate dinner together, shopped together, and confided in one another. Suzie's decision to bring her best friend Stacy home that night wasn't unusual. Cheryl often welcomed Suzie's friends without hesitation, offering them a safe place to sleep and a stocked fridge the next morning. By the time the two young women pulled into the driveway in the early hours of June 7th, the house was calm, familiar. The porch light glowed. Cheryl's small Yorkshire Terrier was settled inside. For Cheryl, it was just another night closing in Springfield. She could not have imagined the storm that was about to sweep away her world. Later, investigators would piece together the timeline. Sometime after Stacy and Suzie entered the house, something happened. Cheryl was there. Her belongings confirmed it. Her car was still in the garage, her keys untouched, her bed seemingly prepared for sleep. But like her daughter and Stacy, she was gone. 3 women in total, swallowed by the night without a sound. What made the case so chilling was Cheryl's presence. If it had been only the 2 young women, some might have suspected they ran off together, on a whim of youth. But Cheryl was older, settled, responsible. She had a job, a home, and deep roots in Springfield. She wasn't someone who would vanish voluntarily. Her disappearance shattered any illusion that this was a simple teenage runaway case. In the puzzle of the Springfield Three, Cheryl's role became both heartbreaking and confounding. A mother, a protector, suddenly as vulnerable as the daughters she loved. Her presence at home that night didn't prevent the tragedy. It became part of it. When friends finally stepped inside the house on East Delmar Street the next morning, what they found didn't make sense. Nothing looked broken. Nothing looked stolen. Yet the air carried a strange unease, as if the house itself knew something terrible had occurred. The women's cars were still parked outside, Cheryl's Corsica in the carport, Suzie's red Ford Escort in the driveway, and Stacy's Toyota Corolla nearby. Their purses sat neatly in the living room, lined up as though waiting to be picked up again. Inside each were wallets, identification, cigarettes, and makeup. Items no young woman would leave behind voluntarily, especially not for long. The television buzzed with static, its screen frozen in grey snow, humming into the empty room. The remote control lay on the floor, as if it had been dropped mid-use. Overhead, the porch light was broken, its bulb shattered. Oddly, someone had swept the glass fragments away, leaving the fixture bare, but the steps strangely clean. Who had taken the time to do that? In the bathroom, Cheryl's small dog, a Yorkshire Terrier named Cinnamon, had been locked inside. When discovered, the little animal was frantic, scratching to be let out, barking as if it had been shut away to keep it quiet during the night. To investigators, this detail suggested intention. Someone had placed the dog there on purpose. The beds told their own quiet story. Susie's and Cheryl's sheets were rumpled, as though someone had begun to settle in but never finished the night's rest. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass, no drops of blood. Just a house paused in time, with its occupants erased. One detail raised even more suspicion. The home's answering machine, still common in the early 90s, had contained a message, according to friends who arrived that morning. But before police could listen, the tape had been mysteriously erased. Whether it was done accidentally or deliberately has never been proven, but the missing message remains one of the most haunting, unanswered questions in the case. For law enforcement, the scene was a nightmare. A crime without a crime scene. Everything in order, yet everything wrong. Police would later call it one of the strangest investigations they had ever encountered. Neighbors recalled nothing unusual that night. No screams, no slamming doors, no suspicious cars idling nearby. The house stood in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where people felt safe enough to leave doors unlocked. And on that June morning, the unlocked door revealed a mystery that would consume Springfield for decades. By the time the sun rose on June 7th, the parties of the previous night had faded into memory. Graduation balloons still clung to fences, and sleepy teenagers recounted stories of the celebrations. For friends of Stacy and Suzie, the plan was simple: meet up the next morning and head to the water park in Branson. It was supposed to be the perfect way to start the summer. When Stacy and Suzie failed to show up at the agreed time, their friends weren't immediately alarmed. Maybe they overslept. Maybe they needed more time to get ready. But after repeated phone calls went unanswered, concern began to grow. A few of their friends, including Janelle Kirby, decided to drive over to Susie's house on East Delmar Street to check in. What they found only deepened the mystery. The cars were all still there. The porch light glowed faintly in the daylight. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the little dog barked desperately from the bathroom. The purses sat in plain sight, untouched. Yet the house itself was silent. No voices, no footsteps, no sign of Cheryl, Suzie, or Stacy. At first, the friends hesitated. Walking into someone's home uninvited felt wrong. But with each unanswered call, the sense of unease pressed heavier. They stepped inside, calling out the women's names, moving cautiously from room to room. Each space looked ordinary. Yet something about the stillness felt off, as though the house were holding its breath. Janelle would later recall how unsettling the scene was. Purses neatly arranged, beds partly turned down, a television left hissing with static. Nothing screamed danger, yet nothing felt right. And then there was the missing message on the answering machine, erased sometime between the night before and that morning. Friends couldn't explain it, and neither could police. Hours passed. Plans for Branson were abandoned. By late morning, families were being contacted. Stacy's mother grew frantic, sensing that something was terribly wrong. Cheryl's relatives insisted it was unlike her to vanish without word. By afternoon, the fear that had been creeping quietly began to take hold. The first call to police wasn't immediate, something investigators would later regret. In those early hours, friends and family had entered the home repeatedly, searching, tidying, even sweeping up the broken glass on the porch. What might have been vital evidence was lost forever. By the time law enforcement officially arrived, the crime scene had already been compromised beyond repair. Still, one fact remained undeniable. 3 women were gone, vanished from a house where they should have been safe. For their families, the nightmare had only just begun, and for Springfield, June 7th would mark the beginning of a mystery that has never been solved. When Springfield police finally arrived at 1717 East Delmar Street, they walked into a case that seemed almost impossible from the start. 3 women, each from different generations, had vanished, leaving behind every belonging that defined their daily lives. No forced entry, no visible struggle, no obvious crime scene. Detectives began by retracing the women's final known steps. They confirmed Stacy and Suzie had been seen at graduation parties late into the night, cheerful and untroubled. They confirmed that Cheryl had been at home, preparing for bed, but somewhere between 2 and 8 a.m., all 3 disappeared. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking questions. Some neighbors remembered hearing a dog barking, others thought they saw unfamiliar cars, but nothing concrete emerged. No one reported screams or suspicious noises. It was as if the women had been plucked from their lives by an unseen hand. Inside the house, officers catalogued what little evidence they could. The purses lined up in the living room. Cigarettes, lighters, car keys, all left untouched. To detectives, this indicated the women had not planned to leave voluntarily. The broken porch light troubled them as well. Had someone smashed it to darken the entryway? And if so, why sweep up the glass so neatly afterward? The erased answering machine message became a focus. Friends insisted there had been a recording earlier that morning, possibly a message left by someone connected to the case. By the time police accessed the machine, the tape was blank. Whether erased by accident, by a visitor, or by the perpetrator, remains one of the most haunting details of the investigation. Detectives expanded their search. They brought in dogs, helicopters, and volunteers to scour fields, wooded areas, and highways stretching out from Springfield. Flyers with the women's faces were plastered across town. Local news carried updates hourly, urging anyone with information to step forward. But leads quickly dried up. One of the greatest challenges was the compromised crime scene. With so many friends and relatives having entered the house before police secured it, potential fingerprints and trace evidence were likely destroyed. Officers would later admit this mistake cost them critical clues. Within days, the case ballooned into one of the largest investigations in Springfield's history. Yet for all the manpower, for all the tips pouring in, detectives found themselves circling back to the same questions. How could 3 people vanish at once? Why was there no sign of violence? And who had the means and motive to make them disappear? The more investigators looked, the stranger it seemed. The Springfield Three were not just missing. They had been erased. In the days following the disappearance, detectives faced a brutal reality. Without a crime scene, without witnesses, suspicion became their only tool. They began compiling a list of possible suspects, people connected to the women, or anyone with a reputation dark enough to raise alarms. The first group under scrutiny were men in the women's orbit. Suzie Streeter had recently broken off a turbulent relationship, and police considered whether an angry ex-boyfriend might have sought revenge. But interviews revealed little more than arguments common to teenagers. No evidence placed him near East Delmar Street that night. Another theory emerged around a local man with a record of violent behavior. He had been incarcerated at the time, but rumors spread quickly in Springfield. Residents whispered about his possible involvement, weaving connections that investigators couldn't prove. Without evidence, suspicion remained just that, suspicion. One particularly disturbing lead came from a convicted criminal already in prison. He told investigators he knew what had happened to the Springfield Three, claiming they had been abducted and buried in a concrete structure. But every time police pressed for details, his story shifted. He offered no proof, no names, no verifiable facts. Still, the image of 3 women entombed beneath concrete would haunt the case for decades. Detectives also weighed broader possibilities. Was this the work of a serial offender, a predator who struck at random? Missouri had seen its share of violent drifters in the early 90s, men who targeted women without warning. Could someone have spotted Stacy and Suzie that night, followed them home, and overpowered all three before anyone could react. Yet the idea of one person controlling three women, two young and fit, one an adult mother, seemed unlikely. Investigators wondered if there had been more than one perpetrator. Two men, perhaps, working together in the dark. That theory explained the lack of noise. With numbers on their side, they could subdue the women quickly and silently. The absence of physical evidence left detectives grasping. Every tip was chased, every rumor logged, but nothing held. In a cruel twist, the sheer scale of attention backfired. Hundreds of leads poured in, many from psychics or self-proclaimed experts. Police had to sift through noise, searching for the faint signal of truth. By the end of the first week, the investigation had generated more questions than answers. No prime suspect, no motive, no timeline that explained the vanishing act on Delmar Street. Springfield was left staring at a riddle. 3 women gone, and no one to blame. As weeks turned into months, the investigation grew colder, and speculation began to take on a life of its own. With no hard evidence to anchor the case, theories swirled through Springfield like smoke, each one more unsettling than the last. One of the earliest theories suggested that the women had left voluntarily. Maybe Stacy and Suzie, fresh from graduation parties, decided on a spontaneous trip. Perhaps Cheryl joined them, and together they slipped away for reasons no one could understand. But that idea collapsed quickly. The purses, money, and keys left behind made no sense. Cheryl was a devoted mother and professional woman. She wouldn't abandon her home, her dog, or her daughter's future. Voluntary disappearance was, to most, unthinkable. Others whispered about a planned abduction. Could someone have been watching the house, waiting for the right moment? The broken porch light and the carefully swept glass suggested preparation. To some, it looked like the work of someone meticulous, someone who wanted to control the scene down to the smallest detail. Rumors also connected the case to organized crime. Springfield wasn't known as a hub for mob activity, but locals speculated that Cheryl, Suzie, or even Stacy had stumbled into something they weren't supposed to see. The idea of the 3 being silenced to cover up a larger crime added a chilling weight, though police never found a single link to confirm it. Perhaps the most terrifying theory was that the Springfield Three had fallen prey to a serial killer. In the early 1990s, the Midwest was dotted with cases of missing women and unsolved murders. Some investigators wondered if the same hand was at work. One name that surfaced was that of a drifter convicted of multiple kidnappings in nearby states. His known methods, luring women, controlling them quickly, leaving little trace, fit disturbingly well. Yet no connection could be firmly established. Then came the psychic claims. Letters arrived at the police department from across the country. People swore they had visions of the women held in basements, trapped in cabins, buried in fields. Investigators followed a few of these leads, if only out of desperation, but each proved fruitless. One of the eeriest suggestions came from a construction site. Years later, workers claimed the women might be buried under the concrete foundation of a local parking garage, poured around the time of the disappearance. The tip gained traction in the media, sparking public pressure to dig. But authorities hesitated, citing cost and lack of evidence. The parking garage still stands, its shadow a reminder of what might lie beneath. Each theory carried its own gravity, and each brought more frustration when it failed to produce answers. As the years went on, the absence of truth became its own presence in Springfield, a weight pressing down on families, neighbors, and the police alike. The possibilities were endless. The reality was one: 3 women had vanished, and no one could explain how. As the years slipped by, the case of the Springfield Three refused to fade. Every so often, a new lead surfaced, just enough to stir hope, just enough to reopen old wounds. But like shadows on the wall, none of these clues ever held shape for long. One of the earliest strange tips came from a woman who claimed she had seen Cheryl, Suzie, and Stacy being held against their will in a house just outside Springfield. She described their appearance in detail, insisting she had glimpsed them through a window. Detectives investigated, but the property showed nothing. The tipster later changed her story, leaving more doubt than clarity. Another lead emerged from a man serving time in prison. He contacted authorities, claiming knowledge of the women's fate. According to him, the three had been abducted, killed, and buried in a location known only to criminals in the area. He even hinted at a specific property. For a moment, hope surged, but when police searched, nothing was found. His story crumbled under questioning, exposed as self-serving fabrication. The strangest rumor came years later, involving the south side of Springfield. A witness reported hearing a chilling confession that the women had been killed and entombed in concrete beneath a new parking garage built downtown. The location seemed plausible. The timeline of construction coincided with the disappearances. Some experts even suggested ground-penetrating radar scans revealed anomalies beneath the concrete. Families begged for excavation, but officials hesitated, citing lack of definitive evidence and the enormous cost of tearing up the structure. To this day, the parking garage stands, its foundation whispered about as a possible unmarked grave. Over the decades, psychic visions, anonymous letters, and late-night phone calls flooded in. Some described the women trapped in a mine shaft. Others claimed they had been taken across state lines. None led to recovery. Each false lead chipped away at the patience of investigators and deepened the torment of the families left behind. Even advancements in technology failed to crack the case. DNA databases, new forensic tools, digital mapping. None could resurrect evidence long since contaminated or lost. Detectives who had once chased the case with youthful energy aged into retirement, handing the files to new generations who inherited the same unsolved mystery. But perhaps the most haunting part was the consistency. Nearly every credible investigator agreed that foul play was the only explanation. 3 women, with no motive to leave, no resources prepared, no hint of planning, gone. Taken together, the man-made silence of that house on Delmar Street seemed to echo louder with each passing year. The Springfield Three became less a case file and more a ghost story, a legend whispered in Missouri, a wound carried by families, a puzzle that refuses to be solved. In the wake of the disappearances, grief did not stay confined to a single home on East Delmar Street. It spread outward, touching families, friends, and eventually an entire city that struggled to make sense of the impossible. For Stacy McCall's parents, the loss was unimaginable. Just hours earlier, they had celebrated their daughter's high school graduation, snapping photos as she held her diploma with a proud smile. The promise of her future, college, friendships, adulthood, was supposed to begin that summer. Instead, her family was left with an empty bedroom, a closet full of clothes, and a silence that no words could fill. Suzie Streeter's relatives were equally devastated. Suzie had been fiercely independent, but she was still deeply entwined with her mother's life. Cheryl and Suzie had leaned on each other through difficult years, and to lose both mother and daughter in the same night was a wound that refused to heal. Their relatives described a kind of double grief, mourning 2 lives at once, bound together by absence. For Cheryl's friends and clients, the shock was just as sharp. At her salon, the chair where she once worked stood empty, a quiet reminder of her sudden disappearance. Clients remembered her as a confidant, someone who listened more than she spoke. In their minds, the idea that Cheryl, steady and dependable, could simply vanish felt like a violation of the natural order. The community of Springfield reacted with both fear and determination. Flyers papered telephone poles, storefront windows, and car windshields. Volunteers organized search parties, combing through fields and rivers, hoping for even the smallest clue. Candlelight vigils lit up the town square, with hundreds gathering to pray and hold signs bearing the women's faces. People locked their doors earlier, looked twice at strangers, and whispered to their children about being careful. But fear also bred suspicion. Neighbors eyed one another differently, wondering if the perpetrator lived among them. Every rumor seemed plausible. Every unfamiliar car, every odd glance was cause for alarm. Springfield, once a place of routine and safety, had become a city haunted by paranoia. For investigators, the community's involvement was both a blessing and a burden. While the outpouring of support brought fresh energy to the search, it also overwhelmed the department with false leads, psychic predictions, and conspiracy theories. Detectives had to balance hope with pragmatism, knowing that every wasted hour chasing shadows pulled them further from the truth. Yet through all the fear and frustration, one thing remained constant: the determination to remember. Families refused to let the women's names fade. They spoke at town halls, appeared on television, and begged for tips. The case became part of Springfield's identity, a story every resident knew, a mystery every newcomer learned. Even decades later, the community still gathers for vigils, their candles flickering in the Missouri night, each flame a vow that Cheryl, Suzie, and Stacy will not be forgotten. As the investigation dragged on without answers, the story of the Springfield Three began to grow beyond the boundaries of the city itself. What had started as a local tragedy soon caught the attention of state and national media, transforming into one of the most enduring mysteries in American true crime. Television crews arrived in Springfield, their cameras panning across the modest house on East Delmar Street. Reporters spoke in hushed tones about the three women who had vanished without a trace. Nightly news broadcasts featured their photographs, smiling portraits of Stacy in her graduation gown, Suzie with her blonde curls, Cheryl with her gentle expression. The images became haunting symbols, replayed again and again until the faces were etched into the public memory. Newspapers across Missouri carried headlines that grew bolder with each passing week. 3 women vanish. No leads in Springfield mystery. Families desperate for answers. National outlets soon followed. Intrigued by the chilling simplicity of the case. 3 women, gone. A house intact. No evidence. No explanation. It was the kind of story that unsettled even the most hardened readers. True crime programs in the 1990s seized on the case. It appeared on shows like America's Most Wanted and Unsolved Mysteries, exposing millions of viewers to the baffling disappearance. Tips poured in from across the country, though few had substance. Still, the coverage kept the case alive, ensuring it never slipped entirely into obscurity. Over the years, the Springfield Three became a fixture in the growing world of internet sleuthing. Online forums buzzed with theories, dissecting every known detail, speculating about the missing phone message, the broken porch light, the possibility of multiple perpetrators. Some theories bordered on the absurd, but others reignited interest, prompting law enforcement to revisit old leads with new eyes. For the families, the media attention was both a lifeline and a burden. On one hand, it ensured their loved ones were never forgotten, their names carried into homes far beyond Missouri. On the other, it meant living under a spotlight that sometimes magnified their pain. Rumors, false accusations, and endless speculation about their daughters and sister filled the airwaves. Still, they endured, believing that visibility was the only way forward. Even decades later, the case has not lost its pull. Documentaries, podcasts, and YouTube channels revisit the mystery, each retelling capturing a new generation of listeners who can't help but wonder how 3 people could simply vanish. The Springfield Three have become more than victims. They are legends, their absence a story told again and again, echoing far beyond the city where it all began. And yet, beneath the headlines and broadcasts, one truth remains. Media may keep the story alive, but it cannot solve it. The silence inside that house still lingers, untouched by cameras or headlines. More than 3 decades have passed since the night Cheryl, Suzie, and Stacy vanished. Their house on East Delmar Street is long gone, demolished years after the investigation stalled. But the mystery remains, as stubborn and haunting as ever. Time has eroded many things. Memories blur, witnesses grow old, detectives retire. But the question at the heart of this case has never faded. How can 3 women disappear from their own home without leaving behind a single trace? Families still wait for answers. Every anniversary of June 7th brings renewed pleas, fresh news articles, and quiet vigils where candles flicker against the darkness. In the crowd, faces change. New generations who never met the Springfield Three, yet feel the weight of their story. They gather not because they knew Cheryl, Suzie, or Stacy, but because their absence has become part of the city's soul. Investigators admit the trail is cold. Evidence that might once have spoken has long since gone silent. Yet, in cases like this, silence can be deceptive. All it takes is one voice, one overlooked witness, one buried confession, one fragment of truth to break it wide open. Until then, the Springfield Three exist in a liminal space, not forgotten, but not found. Some believe they are buried beneath concrete. Others think their bodies rest in hidden woods beyond the city limits. And a few cling to the faint, improbable hope that one or more of them might still be alive. Theories abound, but facts remain elusive. The mystery persists, like an unfinished sentence hanging in the air. What is certain is the legacy they left behind. Cheryl, the devoted mother. Suzie, the spirited young woman with her whole life ahead of her. Stacy, the graduate, smiling in her cap and gown just hours before fate intervened. They deserve to be remembered not only for their disappearance, but for their lives, their laughter, their futures, their humanity. Springfield carries their absence like a scar, and for anyone who dares to look closely at this case, it's impossible not to feel the chill. If 3 people can vanish without explanation, what does that say about the safety we take for granted? The house is gone, the years have passed, but the mystery endures. And somewhere, someone still knows the truth. If you've stayed with this story until the end, let us know your thoughts. Which theory makes the most sense to you? Could the women still be hidden beneath concrete, or is the answer buried in a place no one has dared to look? Don't let their story fade, keep their names alive. And if you want to hear more mysteries like this one, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Silent Traces, because some stories are too important to disappear.